Okay, we're back. When we left the group, we'd just had the big plot reveal moment. To briefly sum up, everybody in the group except Rinoa and including Cypher were together as children in an orphanage. Adir was our matron, and Ellone was also there as Sis, although we didn't see her. Most of the party had forgotten this because of the Guardian forces that we've been using since childhood in order to make ourselves into super soldiers, but one person hadn't, Irvine, and it's been bothering him for so long until now, when finally he decided to tell us. That's the Cliff Notes version. The scene is one of the game's most famous, or some would perhaps say infamous, scenes. Unlike the livestream moment in FF7, it's not one that's popular. I broke it down and analysed it somewhat while it was happening, but for the sake of moving it along, I purposefully avoided problems until now. Because, you know, there are a few. Now, I don't hate the scene like a lot of people do. In the universe and the story that the game is trying to tell, I think a lot of it makes sense. Not all, but a lot. One complaint against it is that in the end, a lot of the revelations don't really matter much, in that it doesn't particularly matter that Ellone was at the orphanage, and at the end of the day, despite knowing that Adir is the matron, we're still going to fight her, even kill her. And that's perhaps true. It's certainly valid to ask what's actually changed as a result of these revelations, and truthfully, not much has. But then they do add very important backgrounds and motivation, especially seeing as we knew nothing of Adir really, if you think about it. All we knew was that she was Cid's wife, and that doesn't explain why she's such a big bad villain. What we know now doesn't either, but it at least increases the level of curiosity. The two big problems that do hurt the scene are very identifiable: the whole Guardian Forces explanation, and the role of Irvine himself. Seriously, why didn't he ever say anything? Let's go for the Guardian Forces first and how they eat your brain. I think that for a lot of people playing this, the negative effects of GFs can come completely out of the blue here. If this is the first time you've heard about it in the game, then it comes as totally out of left field. Whether you've heard about it depends on how much time you've spent chatting to people. The issue of GFs causing brain damage does come up a couple of times, but if you've not been talking to anyone, you may not know that. If you have, there's still issues, although it can at least illuminate some aspects of the plot, such as how you should actually feel about Cid Kramer, the man who raises these child soldiers and augments their brains. Again, and this is a question I posed right when we were first looking at Cid, what about all the people that don't make it? Cid is not a nice man. In fact, Cid is a total scumbag. It almost makes more sense for him to be the true villain of FF, as opposed to Adir. FF8, as we know, strives for subtlety. There is so much that you miss if you don't talk to people. But this, it's a bit too far. Even just one line that you had to see could have been enough. You could have even done it in Christis's class right at the beginning. And then it's, well, something that everyone can recall. So, you know, that probably should have been there. The other issue is that while you can justify the GFs being damaging to the folks who grew up in Balamb, when Selphie says that, oh, she picked one up while she was in Trabia, that is a reach, a big one, way too much of one. It's far too convenient and it cheapens the whole thing. The GF is kind of a consequence of FF8 having to justify everything that happens in gameplay in story, and when you're spinning that level of bullshit, you wonder if it would be easier for everyone to have just, you know, forgotten. Back in the orphanage, our characters are all around 3 to 4 years old. Most people don't remember or have very faint memories from that age. Not all, mind. Some people remember a little more. Would it have been better for Irvine to be that way? Or not to remember everything as he seems to, but for him to just remember a little more, enough to collectively jog everyone else's memory so that gradually they piece everything together without having the whole GF thing? I reckon that might have been better. At least then you don't have to resort to such silly conveniences. The GF thing does more bad than good, to be honest. It introduces some bad contrivances and cheapens a few relationships. Zell and Cypher, for example, doesn't matter as much when there's this big hand-wavy reason as to why they don't like each other. Irvine, of course, is another problem, perhaps the biggest one. There's just no valid reason for him to bring up virtually nothing about the shared childhood he knows everything about until now. Again, you could argue that there are very subtle hints that the way he acts with Selphie is overfamiliar, especially right after they've met. But even there, he's kind of equally overfamiliar with Rinoa, who has nothing to do with any of this, so it doesn't register. Again, would it have hurt to have just a flicker of recognition? Irvine as a character in our party is kind of on shaky ground as it is. It's just too convenient that he ends up getting picked to join our party, and even more so that he was then connected to the party the whole time. But that's not the worst thing. Let's go back to Dealin City, the assassination attempt. Irvine and Squall in the crowd, with a deer right there for the world to see. Squall doesn't recognise her, but Irvine obviously does. Or should. There needs to be a flicker of recognition for Irvine that she is matron, and there isn't at all. Even when Irvine starts to choke, something that again puts him on shaky ground because we wonder how he's Galbadia's best sniper if he's so prone to choking, why isn't it mentioned that the choking is, at this point, because Irvine is tasked with killing matron? A mother figure, who he knows. Why doesn't it come up? It's not like everything has to pour out Len even. Irvine could blurt out matron, and Squall wouldn't know what the fuck he was talking about, but it would give us an important hint, and then less of this whole thing would just come from nowhere. I admire FF8's dedication to subtlety, I really do, but there are a lot of times where it just goes way too far. And even that, perhaps, is not the worst thing. What about the D-District prison? Irvine was ordered to pick Rinoa up from prison by General Caraway, and so he did that. And apparently, he initially planned to return Rinoa to him until Rinoa convinced him to help with breaking the party out of jail. So yeah, our childhood friend, the one who knows all of this and is closer to the party than they truly know, was kind of all set to leave us in prison to rot and probably be executed. It's only thanks to the one person who he comparatively barely knows that he came back and helped. Nice, huh? That's one serious frickin' ball drop. Considering Irvine's relationship to the party, how the hell did that get in there? Was it just a mistranslation? I mean, you hope so, because goddamn. Irvine. He's just very badly written and terrible as a character. Thinking about it, after all his vomiting of plot exposition, I have even less reason to like him than I did previously, and I really didn't like him before. I hate him now. In the end, the whole thing is what it is. It's one of FF8's big turning points, where all of our party get a serious dose of characterisation, where the themes of the game actually come into focus. It's not terrible, but it's not without flaws. And, you know, we're no further along after it, and perhaps that is disappointing, especially if you compare it to the livestream, FF7's big moment where just about everything came together and the main character truly at last became whole. Mind you, there are still obviously lots more plot points to come. It should be noted, by the way, that the character who benefits most from this whole scene is undoubtedly Squall. It is in many ways his true breaking point, and his admission that things were kind of screwed up. Again, it's subtle, you might not notice it still, but there is that one line admitting that, no, in actuality Squall was not okay at all. Now you might have noticed that unlike quite a few people, I have a lot of time for Squall as a character, and I'm interested in his development more than just about anything else, and this scene is a big part of that. As for how this scene will affect what's to come, for that we must continue playing. Our next storyline destination is Adia's house down south, which obviously means we're going just a little ways further north and hitting up Shumi village. Shumi is an optional place. We don't have to go there at all, in fact, at pretty much any point in the game, but it's nice to come here as a little stopgap in the midst of all the revelations. And again, there's plot points here that you might miss. Also, it has a draw point where you can get Ultimate, one of the best spells in the game, as it often is in FF. Although here that obviously means for Junction, and as we don't use offensive spells. I don't think I've used an offensive spell since the start of Disc 1. Anyway, Shumi is a very pretty place indeed, filled with kind and welcoming Shumis. Also, a sculptor's working on a statue for Laguna. It turns out that at some point he wound up here after having to be taken care of again. This is also why those Moombas helped Squall out back in the prison. Shumis eventually evolve into something else, and most of them become Moombas. They obviously sensed a connection between Laguna and Squall. We can help with this statue by collecting a few stones and going on a nice quest that's mostly designed to welcome us to Shumi and get to know their nice non-human people. It's a simple side quest, but it's one that's very much worth doing. It's a lovely place, one of the best looking in the game. Another little stop for us is in Dealin, where it's worth paying a visit to General Caraway. At first he only asks us to take care of Rinoa, but he does offer some useful background that I've not yet gone into. As has become clear, there are a lot of connections to the Sorceress War, a time when Galbadia fought Esthar, who are under the control of a sorceress named Adele. Esthar is somewhere on the eastern continent that we've not paid a visit to yet, but it has disappeared from view. Galbadia ultimately won the war by making herself as powerful as she could possibly become, and they did this by taking over just about every other city they could. It's an important note on just how Galbadia became so powerful. They did it in order to combat a force that was, presumably, far greater and perhaps even more dangerous. But in the aftermath, well, they ended up just becoming more and more of a militaristic dictatorship. With the rise of Esthar, Galbadia itself isn't even really in control anymore. They're in a very confused state. Anyway, our next regular plot destination is in the southwest, the Centra area, in other words. Esdhar's orphanage is there near a lighthouse. We can go there, but we can't enter. Why? Because just a little ways away, Galbadia Garden is sitting and waiting. And so the inevitable happens. If Galbadia Garden is here, that obviously means that Cypher and Esthar are there too. Everything's been building up to another big fight, and the planet is just not big enough for two massive floating ships running about. It's time for war. As the two gardens spot each other, Squall has to deliver an address and get his people ready for a fight. You get to pick the orders, although it doesn't change an awful lot. It merely emphasises the big task and the responsibilities that Squall has to take literally head on as Balamb rams into Galbadia Garden's field, where Cypher awaits on the brig in a perfect mirror image. As the fight begins, competence is still very much struggling to assert itself. Apparently Zell is asleep. He's obviously not, but for some reason that's being covered up. We motivate troops and stop them from dawdling around, we go to the quad where Zell actually is, and then to the front gate where we expect Galbadian troops to attack from. As far as control goes, we start with Zell's team, including Rinoa. Zell gives Rinoa a ring that he's borrowed from Squall, although we don't exactly know the significance. Anyway, one of the silliest moments in the whole game follows. The two gardens collide, and a piece breaks off of the quad. One that just so happens to have Rinoa on it, leaving her dangling and out of action. Considering what we know about Rinoa and her willingness to fight and actually get shit done in spite of everything, this kind of feels like a very cheap way to just get rid of her for the next bit that's not in line with what's been going on. Suddenly she's the silent movie damsel hanging off the cliff waiting for someone to come. And so, having screwed the pooch yet again, Zell now has to go and find Squall to tell him that Rinoa's in trouble and hope that he doesn't immediately rends a kook in his ass. Squall doesn't take the news particularly well, especially as the enemy are here and everyone else is fighting. But news that they've breached the classroom on the second floor means that it can't even take priority now, despite Irvine as usual being a shithead. It's important to note how stacked the odds are against us. Balamb's primary force, Seed, is a small group that's built for external missions, and so the majority of people at Balamb are just cadets, young cadets. Galbadia Garden doesn't have Seeds, instead they have a group who have all been trained for combat as a large mass, basically it's an army. And if you chatted with Martine earlier, you'll know that it's not really a garden anymore. He and most of the other students were kicked out so that Esthar and Cypher could use it as a base. But even before that, the place was essentially a military academy pumping out soldiers for the G-Army. So, you know, we're not fighting fellow garden students here. We're fighting G-soldiers, paratroopers, rocket bikers, and the best of Galbadia's army. While one seed is potentially worth about 50 of them, we only have a handful at our disposal. Cadets can only defend against them for so long. After thwarting the second wave, it's clear that Balamb won't last another, and so we make the decision to attack, to ram straight into Galbadia Garden and swarm on them as much as possible. Squall relays this to the Garden in what certainly counts for him as an inspirational speech, the strongest confirmation yet of his leadership. Oh, by the way, Rinoa is still hanging there. I really hope she's got some strong delts. I suppose we should save her, shouldn't we? According to the group, Squall is the only one who can do this for, reasons, and so he goes to do so, but on the way he ends up getting bullied by this one troop. Ultimately the fight sprawls out onto a rope, thus beginning a really frickin' annoying minigame where you punch and kick this guy, timing blocks when necessary that is very easy to fail. Fortunately, failure is not a game over. After winning, Squall finally manages to save Rinoa at least, and they land on the front of Galbadia Garden, thus beginning a really awesome sequence as they run through the battle. We can see that the decision to attack was a smart one, as Balamb's cadets are getting the better of a Galbadian force that didn't expect this aggression. Perhaps Squall's speech had something to do with it. Rinoa returns that win to Squall, by the way. It seems like it's yet another attempt to get the two together that, by this stage, might not exactly be needed. Especially when, there's a frickin' battle going on. I mean, priorities, people. Finally, we join the rest of our party inside of Galbadia Garden. The garden itself is surprisingly pretty sparse. There's not many people here at all. Again, this bears out the idea that most of the students were dismissed once Cypher and Esthar took over. But it does mean that for the most part, it's another quite boring dungeon where not a lot's happening and most of the screens are the same. The main gimmick is that you have to find a couple of students milling around who are on your side and in possession of keycards so that you can gain access to the headmaster's room. You also fight a GF along the way, Cerberus. Fujin and Raijin are here too, but despite what we said last time, they really don't want to fight. As loyal as they are to Cypher, they recognise just how much he's changed, and they're not here to fight for Esthar. This is something of a depressing bit for them. Even the usually eager to fight Fujin is, quite simply, fatigued. In the end, we just leave them. Finally though, we get to the Master's room. Cypher is eager to fight, while Esthar is relaxed and cocky. Cypher still sees us as the monsters and himself as the knight, with the added impetus of having not forgotten his upbringing. He knows who Esthar is, which makes him all the more motivated to protect her. The Cypher fight is a bigger challenge than it was the first time, even if there's 3 of us and 1 of him, but ultimately he fails. Esthar dismisses him as foolish and then descends into the auditorium. Once again she talks to us as though we were mere bugs to be crushed under her feet. It is odd though in a way. She actually does not bring up the past at all, for as big a thing as it's become for us. But we can't think about the past either. We have to fight her again. Cypher still tries to defend her, although he's less used now. Nothing can stop the big fight to the death, which naturally we do win. Esthar's tough, but we can handle it. But before she can be finished off, something happens again. Esthar steps back, stricken, hurt, and notably different. Something, quite visibly, has been lifted. After the battle she calls our names. Suddenly she's not Sorceress Esthar anymore. She's Esthar Kramer, our matron. She praises us, but is also greatly concerned about whether she was able to save Ellone. But before anything else, Rinoa goes over to the fallen Cypher and kisses him, seemingly reviving him, but then she collapses. No one knows exactly what's happened, and it's in this state of total confusion where Disc 2 comes to an end. Before going anywhere else, let's look at Disc 2 some more. I was a bit worried going in after the end of Disc 1 and how silly things got at the end of that, but you know what? Disc 2 actually comes together really frickin' well. For all the flaws there are in the orphanage scene, it is the part of the game where the motivations do come together, and most of the reveals are perfectly fine with the exception of Irvine being the one to do it, and those bloody GFs. In any case, it's followed by what, aside from a couple of little bits, might be the best sequence in the whole game. The Battle of the Gardens is an absolute showstopper. The FMVs are outrageous, as are the action scenes. Yeah, it's stupid for Rinoa to be taken out like that. It's also annoying for all the other party members to act like dicks and shout about her to Squall when not only does he have to think of everyone as leader, but they could easily rescue her themselves and indeed probably should. And it's silly pacing for Rinoa and Squall to have a big old heart-to-heart while the battle's all around them. But still, there's those frickin' rocket bikes jumping onto Balamb Garden, and when there's that, you can forgive anything. This game is worth playing for a good few reasons, but the Battle of the Gardens is right up there, a grand moment. Perhaps there's another reason why Disc 2 is generally very good. Weirdly, in many ways it feels like it could be an ending, and that Disc 1 and 2 could easily be their own game. For most of that time we've chased Esthar, we've had the big moment when we realised who she was, and then in the end we freed her, although sadly it appears that one of us died in the conflict. Seriously, Final Fantasy VIII could end here. A fair few people would probably say that it should have ended here. But obviously, there are still 2 more discs. They aren't filled with bonus content. We're just getting started, aren't we? Now, there's more I could start analysing right now, particularly characters, as a lot has changed, especially with Squall and Rinoa, but we're kind of in the middle of all of that, so it can wait a bit. For now, let's get on with the story. Back in Garden, Rinoa is in a coma. No one can figure out what's happened to her at all. Squall is very upset about this, but is trying not to show it and remain a leader. And as for Esthar, well, she's back at the orphanage. The only thing we can do at the moment is go there, talk to her, and find out just what on earth happened. How come she's no longer our enemy? The orphanage, well, it's seen better days. For better or worse, Sid shows up. After making Squall a leader, he basically disappeared, even though his presence would have undoubtedly helped matters. It goes to show that in the end, well, he's just a coward. Edea reveals to us the truth, that she allowed herself to be possessed by another, altogether more powerful sorceress named Ultimecia, who comes from the future. She did this in order to protect Ellone, who Ultimecia desires to obtain in order to complete her plan to compress the world's timeline and bring herself fully to our present. Whenever we faced Edea in the past, we weren't facing her, we were facing Ultimecia in her form. The importance of Ellone presumably comes from her special ability to take people back to the past. Again, the subject of Esthar and the Sorceress War comes up. No one knows what happened to Esthar or its leader, Sorceress Adele, but Edea believes that while she could possibly be possessed again by Ultimecia at any time, the future sorceress is now attempting to join herself with Adele, who Edea believes to be still alive. Adele, unlike Edea, is apparently almost wholly evil. If Adele and Ultimecia come together, well, that's when shit will most certainly hit the fan. So, yeah, that's a lot to take in pretty quickly. This is the first time that we know the identity of our true antagonist, and she kinda comes from nothing. The same is said of the notion of time compression and how that affects our story. It helps if you know a little bit about sorceress lore. Generally, the rule in FF8's world is that a sorceress cannot die until they have passed their skills, essentially their soul, onto someone else, which is why Edea believes that Adele is still around. There's also the reasons for the time compression, which currently come across as mumbo-jumbo. Essentially, it boils down to this. Ultimecia wants to shorten the timeline in order to create a world where she is the only sorceress who can exist, consuming all others to create an all-powerful entity that no normal force could hope to match. As a sorceress, she can exercise a degree of mind control on regular people, from Dealin's populace to Cypher, but she can only completely possess other sorceresses, most likely one at a time. That's about all we can deduce for now with what we've got. Edea knows little else and does not know what happened to Inoa. Perhaps unsurprising, seeing as she doesn't know her at all in the first place. Squall finds it hard to control his emotions right now, and all he can do is go back to the infirmary to watch over Inoa's body, something that the game doesn't fully make clear but should be easy enough to grasp from the hints. Squall is desperate for Inoa to give him a sign. While he is still uneasy about showing his emotions to other people, it's so clear how much he feels for her. And once again, Squall collapses. We're back with Laguna for our fourth flashback. This flashback is short, and on the surface is more comedic. It's a look at Laguna and Kios's time in Trabia filming a movie. You can get a hint about this earlier on if you've been picking up the Timber Maniacs magazines from around the world. Laguna did end up becoming a journalist after all, and he wrote about his travelling experiences in said mag. When you find them, Selphie records the contents of each mag in her diary, which you can access in the computer in the classroom. The one that you may well have not looked at since the very start of the game, in other words. It is useful though, as it does provide some much needed colour. Anyway, Laguna is shooting a film about a sorceress and a knight, and is tasked with defending the sorceress from a dragon who should be played by Kios. Unfortunately, it turns out to be a very real dragon who we have to beat, primarily in another rubbish timing-based fighting minigame. The flashback ends just as Laguna spots a red light in the distance. Now this is all very comedic, but there's a big and subtle hint here. When Laguna wields a gunblade and assumes a stance with it, it is the exact same stance that Cypher takes with a gunblade. The movie that they were shooting is the same movie that Cypher saw when he was a child, the one that inspired his ambition to be the knight protecting a sorceress, essentially the movie that made him. Another very intriguing connection indeed. Speaking of connection, the main reason for the existence of this flashback is so that Ellone can speak to Squall. That mind link is still there, and it's the only way that Ellone can reach him. Squall, well, he's changed. A lot. In truth, the time compression, Ultimecia, sorceresses, all of that stuff, doesn't really interest him. The situation with Rinoa has brought his one true motivation to the forefront. He cares about little else except Rinoa being okay and coming back. There's a few callbacks in this whole situation. Squall's reaction is reminiscent of how he was when everyone thought that Cypher had been executed. There's direct references. At one point, Squall comments about how talking to Rinoa is like talking to a wall. the exact Finn he was when Christis was expressing her feelings to him way back at the graduation. The shoe's on the other foot now. Squall asks Ellone to let him into Rinoa's immediate past so that Finn's can be changed, but it's hopeless. You can't actually change the past. And besides, Ellone can't do that. She doesn't know her. Even so, Squall's one plan is to somehow find Ellone and bring Rinoa to her, so that somehow she can use her powers to bring her back. Somehow being the key word here. Even with the world in peril from some unknown, potentially catastrophic force, it's nothing in Squall's mind compared to Rinoa. Even when Esthar was explaining how disastrous the arrival of Ultimecia would be for the world, Rinoa was the only thing on his mind to the point where he literally had to be snapped out of his reverie. That might be a shock, perhaps even outrageous motivation for some, especially for someone who is supposed to be the hero of this piece. But then let me ask you this, how heroic in actuality is Squall Leonhardt? How heroic is he supposed to be? I'm not going to analyse that yet, it's merely something to ponder as the next chapters play out. Now, the last time we saw Ellone was when she was taken from Balamb by a white ship, run by a group calling themselves Esdhar's Seed. Presently, said ship is our only lead. Esthar knows little about it, but believes it to be stationed somewhere on the central continent and has written up a letter that hopefully should convince them to help us. That's all we know. You've got to look for said ship yourself. This can be a pain, but it's not all that far from where we are. As long as you search slowly and methodically, it hopefully won't take that long to find. At least it didn't take me that long. I have heard horror stories. Naturally, the folks on the ship take a fair bit of convincing. Initially, they will refuse to tell you anything about Ellone whatsoever. Before offering the letter to the leader, you can walk around a bit. You can find out just who these people are. They are Esdhar's Seeds, as in her children. It wasn't just our party and no one else at the orphanage, and Matron cared for these orphans too. Before being possessed by Ultimecia, Esthar was the captain of this ship. But when she knew that she was about to be taken, she made plans to protect Ellone by sending her to Garden before leaving the ship altogether. We also run into two people we've not seen in ages, Zone and Watts, aka the other members of the Timber Resistance. The Galbadians went after them following that disastrous mission, but they escaped and wound up being taken in here. All is cheery at first, until the subject of Rinoa comes up. We promised to protect her, and now she's in a coma. Zone, who we've mostly seen getting stomach cramps and rushing to the bathroom, is now calling Squall a son of a bitch and threatening to knock him out. A jarring character shift? No. More of a sign of just how much shit has changed, really. Things have gotten way serious since Timber. Finally, we meet with the leader, give him Esdhar's letter, and convince him to tell us the story. And as you might have expected by now, Ellone isn't here anymore. The Galbadians did manage to find the ship in the end and gave chase, ultimately trapping them here, until something odd happened. An Esthar ship appeared and started fighting the Galbadians. Now keep in mind that no one has seen an Esthar ship or Esthar soldiers for 17 years. At first they try to convince the Seeds to abandon ship, but naturally they refuse. However, Ellone comes out, sees who they are, and decides to go with them, literally running and jumping onto their ship. At which point, the Esthar ship retreated. And so, Ellone's in Esthar, the big eastern continent we haven't been to yet. Indeed, we haven't been able to go there. The entire continent is blocked off by a huge mountain range, meaning that there's no way for Garden to make landfall. We need shores for that. Looking at the map, you might think that Latrabia and Esthar continents are connected and we could get in that way. However, the obvious path is blocked by a huge crater. Said crater is indirectly important to the game's lore, although not for reasons that would make sense currently. Even when we get to these reasons, it might be a bit of a reach. There is only one way into the continent, and it's at Fisherman's Horizon, a long disused railway that stretches out over the ocean from Esthar to Galbadia, only accessible to us at Fisherman's Horizon. By the way, in case you don't know, Fisherman's Horizon is populated by a lot of former Esthar mechanics. It's insinuated that the mechanics left Esthar, but the scientists stayed behind. Now before we go there, it should be noted that there's some big plot development in Dealing City, and like a lot of FF8 things, it's the sort of plot development you may well never see because there is no reason to go to Dealing right now, nor is there anything new to do there. However, what's changed? Well, Esthar isn't their leader anymore, don't forget that. Instead, Cypher is. It appears that he is still taking orders from a sorceress, and there's only really one that it can be. The Galbadians are as militaristic as ever under Cypher's command, and have apparently just dredged up some huge Esthar-made obelisk from the ocean that, well, no one knows what it does actually, but it's kind of worrying in any case. Worrying is a key word actually. Cypher cannot, after all, influence the minds of a populace in a way that a sorceress can. The people of Dealing are concerned about the actions of their new leader, and are wondering why there can't just be peace. It seems that they've recovered from being brainwashed. Anyway, short of going to Shumi and drawing some more Ultima, or taking part in various other somewhat minor side quests, there is little to do except go east. Obviously there are no trains running between Fisherman's Horizon and Esthar, so there's only one thing that Squall can really do. He puts Rinoa on his back, leaves the garden parked, and starts walking. A walk that is, presumably, a pretty frickin' long way. This walk seems completely ridiculous at first, but it should be noted that if you've been keeping up with your Timber Maniacs mags, you'll know that Laguna actually travelled to Esthar in the exact same way. The poetic nature of Squall following in Laguna's footsteps justifies the scene well enough. As Squall walks, he talks to Rinoa. Sure, she's unconscious, but this at least allows Squall to talk to someone without his usual inhibitions. It's quite an affecting chat, really. Squall details his faults and how he is, how he purposefully pulls his guard up around people so that no one wants to get close to him as a way of protecting himself from being hurt through losing those people. That's what happened with Ellone, and it's affected Squall ever since. With Rinoa though, things are different. Slowly but surely Squall is changing because of that. It's a far cry from when they first met. Each question that Squall throws to Rinoa isn't so much knowingly rhetorical, but delivered with the slight hope that she'll answer. It's quite a powerful moment. Honestly, for me, this is the moment that pretty much cemented how great a character Squall actually is. The arc that he goes on and how he develops is refreshingly different from a lot of RPG protags all the way through. And again, there's still that question. How good is Squall meant to be, in truth? He is still a mercenary. Is he the best leader around? Well, no, but he's not supposed to be. People often complain about Cid choosing him to be the leader, but in truth there wasn't anyone else who could do it. Cid is a coward, so he's not going to take the lead now that war is afoot. The other potential candidates would have been Christis, Xu, or Dr. Kadawaki. Xu and Kadawaki have important roles already. Christis is the only one who we've seen in battle, but we've seen just how awful a leader she is. If Zell had taken the lead, well, the game would probably be over by now. Maybe Selfie? Could be cool if you wanted every city in the world destroyed by trains covered in glitter and packed with nuclear weapons, I suppose, but as awesome as she is, she's not really a leader either. And you know what I think about our resident stupid fucking cowboy already. So yeah, Squall is kinda the default choice. He's not supposed to be a perfect leader, far from it. It doesn't come naturally to him, and while he has gotten better at it, he's never going to be a great leader. And a big part of that is because in the end, despite his perceived coldness, he is purely motivated by people. Think about it. How many times have you heard Squall say that he's doing something for the good of the planet? He's certainly not doing this for the planet, or to stop a sorceress. It all comes back to FF8 at its core being an intimate story centering around two people. It can be very ridiculous a lot of the time, but that is a constant. Rinoa has had her own progression too and is nowhere near as bad a character now as she initially appeared to be, but we'll get to that. And of course there are those who'll say that actually, Squall isn't here at all, and we'll get to that too. Anyway, one thing does slightly blot this scene's copybook. At the end, right as Squall finally reaches the Esthar continent, guess who's there? Yep, everybody else. They all came along too, which is obviously fine, but what's annoying is that they got here first. How did they do that, when there's seemingly no other way to make it here aside from walking the track? Snatch a handcart while we were snoozing? It's a logical irritance, and the weird thing about FF8 is that the minor logical irritances are somehow far more annoying than the massive ones. Maybe it has something to do with the person they're riding with, mind. Adia is now with us. She wants to come in order to pay a visit to someone named Dr. Odin. You might recall that name from way back in Disc 1. He was the guy who manufactured a necklace that could suppress a sorceress's powers, a prototype of which Rinoa was going to use in her ill-thought-out plan to stop the then-possessed Adia. Adia is well aware that Ultimecia could repossess her at any time. She's with us because she hopes that the Doctor can somehow stop this from happening. She's also with us because, well, if Ultimecia does take her form again, then she's with the people who are the most capable of stopping that, no matter what the cost. This also means that for the time being, Esthar is a selectable party member, one who's pretty good with magic as you would expect. Obviously we use her as it's nice to freshen up the party a bit. I mean, most of the time I usually just go with Rinoa and Selphie. Selphie is the one absolute constant because her banter's great and her character's awesome. Zell often gets a look into if I want some stupidity. Quistis doesn't get used all that much, but is certainly there if Rinoa or Selphie aren't available. And Irvine never gets selected and is perfectly free to fuck off and die anytime he likes because he's the worst character in the entire history of Final Fantasy games. Our next destination is over a dried out lake that, my goodness, is a beautiful destination. It's places like this that make me love the old pre-rendered graphics so much. The arid salt flats are truly desolate, a sign of the hard journey you've got to take. And there's an undead boss monster, which provides a cool opportunity for Esthar, who's just joined us, to hit the damage cap by chucking an X potion in its direction. Finally, we can go no further. The salt stretches out as far as the eyes can see, with no noticeable path through. Weirdly, however, there's a lot of static about, even the odd symbol. Are we in front of a barrier? Suddenly, in what is far from the craziest thing to happen on this disc, a hole opens up in the middle of the air and we can climb towards it via an invisible ladder. It's a fantastic, sudden shift. We move from the salt flats into a small scientific space, until finally we hit an elevator. On the long journey up, the party muses on how there's no turning back now. And indeed, there quite literally isn't. There's certainly no way that we can decide that actually we want to go all the way back to Garden and complete the Card Club side quest instead. We're stuck on this elevator taking us up to something that we do not know. For all we know, it's about to take us to the middle of a blast furnace. Finally, however, it stops, and a window on the world opens. In a game filled with pretty excellent graphics and FMV sequences, especially for 1999, there is perhaps none that's as truly stunning as the Esthar reveal. All of a sudden you're greeted with this huge cityscape, something that covers a massive chunk of the continent. The biggest city we've seen up to this point is Ellone, and Esthar makes it look like Esthar's orphanage. A platform speeds us through the city at a quite staggering pace, and we get to see the architecture. It's like a finished SimCity 2000 project that someone took 4 years to perfect. You can tell from the buildings and the general planning just how science-oriented the city is too. It's advanced to a level far beyond anything else we've ever seen. If this was still Final Fantasy VII and we were worried about the consumption of Mako, then good lord, this shit looks like it would have sucked up the entire livestream within a year. Esthar is big, is what I'm trying to say. It's also, as we'll soon see, quite a challenge to actually get around. Of course, there are more immediate matters. Esthar doesn't get a lot of tourists by virtue of being hidden from view for 17 years, and we have no idea whether we're about to get a welcoming committee or a bullet to the head. It doesn't feel like an oppressive city controlled by an evil mastermind, but then you just don't know, do you? Either way, this feels like quite the inopportune moment to have a flashback. Which of course is what happens. Squall and Selphie go into Dreamtime, while Esthar stands around and probably wonders what the hell just happened and why no one had told her that the party was narcoleptic. So, this is the 5th and final Laguna flashback. In case you're keeping track, this is the current Laguna timeline as we know it. We joined Laguna and his crew, Kiros and Ward, in Ellone City where they were on leave during the Sorceress War. While there, Laguna had a brief romance with Julia Hartley, Rinoa's mother and later a famous sinner, who sadly died in a car crash when Rinoa was aged about 5. In the second flashback, we found the crew at an excavation site where Esthar were uncovering some huge crystal-based structure. Ultimately, Esthar ambushed them on a cliffside and they all had to jump off. Laguna spent the next few months recovering in Windhill under the care of Rain, while also caring for Rain's adopted daughter, Ellone. That's what we can fit together. Before this flashback, we also know that he ended up filming a movie in Trabia, and that he was cared for in Shumi Village, where they look up to him as something of an icon. We also know that he was on his way to Esthar, and you can probably figure out why he was going there. Anyway, Laguna and his crew, Ward has since rejoined us having left his job at the prison, although he is now mute thanks to the cliff fall, have been captured and are being set to work for Dr. Odin. So it seems that he's not a nice guy. The guards can be kind of arsey too, especially if you talk or not do any work. However, we do get a chance to break out which, well, shit. The logic bombs are flying. Why did Laguna have his gun all that time? Now, I know the understandable answer to that. Nobody wants to animate a whole different set of attacks and animations for this single battle against a no-mark soldier who you're going to kill in one hit. Especially not in 3D, it'd take ages. It was easier for people to switch their weapons in the older Final Fantasies, and so they often did. I get that. There could probably have been a better solution, mind you. Anyway, we all come back together and we can break out. Thankfully this isn't another D-District prison. In fact, this place is literally a couple of screens. The next one gives us our first proper glimpse of Dr. Odin and... what the hell is this? Why does he have a massive Lord Percy-esque Tudor collar? Why does he talk with a German accent? What is this? Dr. Odin is weird, one of the characters in the game that really turn people off. He's sort of like Sid as it goes, which is appropriate considering how heavily Sid was influenced by Odin's work. Dr. Odin is in fact the person who came up with the idea of using Guardian forces in the first place. More than that, he's responsible for the use of magic in general, or paramagic as it's called, which we use in conjunction with GFs at the cost of our long-term memory. Others, like say G-soldiers, do use paramagic as well, but they tend to have it as part of a weapon, whereas sorceresses and monsters just use magic naturally. Odin is a brilliant scientist, to be sure, although he is also one that lacks morals and has no qualms with experimenting on people. Combine this with his obvious heavy German accent and... yeah, you get the idea. It's a rather disturbing connotation, which then somewhat jibes with Odin being mostly used as comedic relief. Anyway, it seems as though Odin's tiring of his recent project, which just so happens to be a giant obelisk house in a crystal. We've been hearing a fair bit about this and we finally have a name for it at last, the Lunatic Pandora. Anyway, he's moved on to a girl he's observing and clearly has some special powers. As you might have guessed, said girl is the whole reason that Laguna and company are here. After chasing Odin around, we find out where she is and go rescue her. The building resistance in Esthar, who are tired of the war and of their current leader's dictatorship, Sorceress Adele, decide to flock around the charismatic screw-up Laguna as their new boss, the man who can lead them to eventually overthrowing Adele for good. And finally, Ellone and Laguna share a quick and tender scene where they're reunited at last. Now we know of course that this didn't last, but it's a good way to end this flashback. And yes, this is the last playable Laguna section. We'll find out why soon enough, of course. The Laguna story is again one of the really good things about FF8. He's such a fun character, and it's amusing to see the big similarities between himself and Squall. Laguna displays a lot of Squall's flaws in a more comedic way. He actually does struggle to get close to people, but instead of purposefully shunning away from them, he'll fake a limp instead. It's like someone playing a parody version of Squall in old comic theatre. He does have some tender moments though, and as a leader he clearly motivates people, really does attract them. It may seem at times like he fails upwards into prominence, but that's because he just takes chances now without thinking about the odds. These are characteristics that Squall could have, but he chooses not to believe in them, or outright suppress them a lot of the time. The other interesting thing is how Squall's own relationship with Laguna evolves. At first he dismisses him as a complete moron. Even as late as Shumi, he still thinks that he's something of an idiot. Funnily enough, his thoughts on Laguna seem to change once Rinoa goes into her coma, as if it's making sense for him too, and a lot of Laguna's words come back to him. He feels closer to Laguna as time goes on, especially now. And so, we wake up from the flashback. We are now in Esthar, good and proper, and we are set to be taken to the presidential palace to meet Dr. Odin. An odd place to meet a guy who is actually not the president, but hey ho. Before that, however, it should be said that, believe it or not, we are actually getting very close to the endgame. All the main pieces are slowly falling into place, and not long after this, things are about to get extreme. They might even be about to get ridiculous. There's a pretty large chance that the game's plot could go to a level beyond anyone's wildest imagination. There's going to be an absolute shit ton of stuff to cover, in other words, and after this point there's no real way of stopping. We're just going to have to tear through it. And so the third part will end here. Will the fourth part be enough to end this saga? Currently, I don't even know. We'll just have to see on that front. Bye for now. Thanks for watching this video. If you like this video then please do like it. You could also subscribe to the channel, check me on my Facebook or my Twitter, or indeed my Patreon if you'd like to see things like Google Hangouts or Skype chats or review requests and all that good shit. Now for this video I would like to thank the following: Adam Schaefer, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Audie Soley, Chris Wilkins, Conformist, Dustin Cooper, Gary Pinkett, George Newton, Guatham Blackpool, Guy Middleton, Ian Roberts, James Idd, James Loveridge, Jason Goy, Jason Leach, Jason Stevens, Johan Eriksson, John Scott, Keith Barlow, Kyle F, L. O'Brien, Lee Norris, ManagerSim.net, Mark Heslop, Mark Johnston, Mark Whittington, Martin Pataki, Nanette McCrone, Olaf Albeen, Pete Morris, Peter Sidorn, Filter Prog, Potter Margell, Rachel Maxwell, Romeo, Sean Zoltek, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Taylor Armand, The Unnatural, Tanya J, Twisted Squote, and Vishar D.